Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for reconvening. Once again, I'm sorry to have to interrupt these obviously intense discussions that we've succeeded in provoking, which is exactly the aim of today's conference. So, but we have reached the final point. In some ways, of course, full circle with another round table. Though it's a rectangular table, I see at the end here. I think the real benefit of this final session is going to be for us to draw on the huge wealth of experience that still remains in the audience here this afternoon. But just to kick us off, I'm going to ask the panel that we've assembled a couple of questions. One is to ask them what it is they're going to take home from this conference today. What was the most important thing that, not just that they learned, but they would like other people to have learned or at least got a better appreciation of? And secondly, I think I get a real sense talking to people and listening to conversations that we were right to suppose that people want to have this discussion in Saskatchewan and that this is really only a first step. This is just this should be just the beginning of a larger process. So how we do that? What would be the action items, if you like, that we would have? I'd like you to think about that, and if you have any great suggestions, then please, when the time comes, step up to the microphone and let us know. This may not, perhaps it should not, further involve the School of Public Policy. Perhaps it should, but either way. I'd like this to be not just a one-off event, but something that really kickstarts a larger discussion about energy futures in Saskatchewan. So without further ado, then, let me ask our panel, who should be, members of our panel should be familiar to you all right now. Let me ask Jeremy De Beer, the current Diefenbaker Fellow at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, to lead off with the take-home messages here.
I'll try to be very brief. And I've heard three aspects of integration of energy policy today, and that I think it's useful to summarize and unpack. The first is in respect of the integration of different aspects of policies in respect of different sources of energy, comparing coal and nuclear and oil and gas and biofuels. And I think we need a more nuanced understanding, or perhaps we just need to make our nuanced understanding more explicit, of the different uses of those different sources of energy. So the fact is that we don't put uranium or coal in our vehicles for transport fuel, and we don't keep the lights on with ethanol. And I think understanding that helps us to appreciate and integrate different aspects of an energy policy. The second aspect of integration that I think is worth thinking about is integration of energy policy with other public policies. And this is second nature for me, with a focus on biofuels, because biofuels is really at the confluence of all kinds of different public policies. It is in part energy policy, but it is also in part environmental policy, and it's in part about food and agriculture, and it's in part about regional economic development, especially rural economic development, and it's in large part about science and technology innovation. So I think we need to think about integrating our energy policy with other public policies. And then the third aspect of integration that I'd suggest we think about is a jurisdictional integration. And it's very clear that we need to think about ways in which we can integrate Saskatchewan's energy policy with the energy policies of other provinces or other regions, and as well with other countries. And there are different forums and different mechanisms for doing that, and I think that's worth having a discussion about. So in summary, these three aspects of integration: integration among different sources of energy, integration among energy policy and other public policies, and jurisdictional integration. And I think it's helpful to sort of remind ourselves about those different aspects of integration in moving forward with a discussion.
Thank you. Linda.
Thank you. Our panel talked about citizen engagement and gaining the confidence of citizens. They're not the same thing, but they do really relate to one another, because gaining the confidence of your citizens is inherently important for politicians to do that. And so Although we were a panel that talked more about the how, but inevitably we talked about the what, which was the making sure that the options were on the table, a broad set of options, and that was important for engagement, but also for confidence, is for people to feel that it was on the table. There was some discussion about, whether it was complex or that people could understand complexity, but on the other hand, whether we like it or not, it is a complex issue, and so how are you going to do this? There was both an optimism about how to do good consultations. There was certainly, we talked about some of the ideals of ways of doing consultation and getting people engaged, and how you would do that. But also a reality check of some of the things we heard earlier in the day about, meeting the window and getting things done, and do you shrink the consultation envelope, or do you keep it big, or whatever. So there was certainly, I think, from all of us, some lessons learned from experiences that we'd had. I think what came out to me is that although there's no perfect way of doing it, that there has to be a sense of learning from other consultations that happen. We tend to love to reinvent the wheel a little bit and start clean on this, but learning about what worked and didn't work, and our able chair, Dan Perrin, took it on the chin a few times and came up smiling about consultations. But I think that this is too important not to do well. So prepare, and continuous communications with people, and being prepared to adjust. But a reality check that in all of this, it comes down to politicians needing to make some decisions, being transparent and accountable for those decisions based on the best input that we can do.
James, the view from Ontario.
Okay, well, I also seem to have 3 points. So the first one is just that I think it's extremely encouraging that this event has happened, and so in that sense I want to commend the organizers and so on, because it's extremely positive that we're beginning to talk about longer term visions about energy planning, energy strategy, energy integration, and that we're putting all the different dimensions on the table, the different sources of energy, consumption as well as production, transmission, or getting from production to consumption, and so on. So I think that's just the first thing that I would take away. I guess the second thing I think is important is to see this as part of a long-term process. And when we talk about things about, say, engaging with the public or things like that, I think we really should be thinking in terms of developing a dialogue and practices and arguments and so on that we know are going to stretch for several decades ahead. So this is not about kind of a crash course, wake up people, explain them the key choices, get them to make it. This is going to be an iterative process. Some things are going to become clear, some things are going to fall apart, there'll be a conflict, a decision made will be reversed. That's the way it's actually going to go. But by starting the dialogue, at least we kind of take the first step. And I guess the last thing I would just say is more in my role as kind of from Ontario. I was struck by the minister's speech at lunchtime. As I said to the person sitting next to me as he was kind of wrapping up and saying, basically, there are resources, and if anybody wants to try and pinch anything from us, they got another thing coming. I said, well, it's not that subtle, is it? And my point is, my point is not really, not a criticism with the minister or whatever, but it's just that there are two things. One is that it shows that there is a historical legacy from the National Energy Plan, and there are lots of feelings about that process. But I would say, kind of from the point of view of a historian of energy policy, that history, that legacy of the national energy policy is one that is constantly remade and bits of the history get left out in the telling, depending on who's doing the telling. So there were changes in the world context, a crash in the price of oil to, a couple of dramatically from where it had been. A lot of stuff happened. And when one tells stories, naturally one emphasizes some bits of the story. So I think that those sorts of feelings, the pride people have in their own resources, the fact of the Constitution, and the fact that of jurisdictional differences and each province's right to develop its own resources, those are realities of Canadian politics. But what I would say is it's sticking one's head in the sand a little bit if one thinks that that will suffice, because 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, into the future, there will be international pressures and changing context that will mean one way or another, it will be important that Canadian provinces and the federal government work out ways around this, workarounds, so that we can have a more coordinated policy. And in one last thing, I just want to mention, the European Union, a lot of people know that they've done more on climate change than we have. Now, I'm not going into how good it is and the conditions are all different and all the rest, but to the extent that they have been able to do things, one of the key reasons was the existence of an explicit burden-sharing agreement among European states. They sat down around a table and said, the Germans and the Brits, the French to some extent, said, we think climate change is really important. We're going to go ahead and do stuff even if it costs us a lot. And other European states said, well, like the Spanish and the Irish, we're poor, our GNP is way less. There's no way you're going to get us to do anything on climate change for at least 10 years. And they explicitly divided burdens. And they used criteria like how rich is the country, how easy are the emissions reductions to divide up the thing. Bizarrely, this group, which isn't even a country, has a better mechanism for burden sharing than Canada does, which has no explicit way to negotiate such a deal. But it's obvious that some places can make, if you're thinking about climate change, emissions reductions easier or lower cost than other regions. So those regions may do it for a decade or 15 years or 20 years. But at some point, the piper will have to be paid, and those who aren't making an early effort will have to make a later effort. So that actually happened in Europe, but it's just a thing for us to think about the difficulties in Canada about explicitly dealing with burden sharing.
I've got 5 points, but 2 are close. So really 4.5 maybe. And some of them are just almost key words for me, or key phrases. The first one that I heard, and I think it was early this morning, was energy literacy. I thought that was a really appropriate term for the kind of discussions that we've had today. And obviously we have to continue to have. And my wife is a teacher and a consultant, and she'd come home, and she still comes home, of course. She talks about literacy and how important it is to the kids, and how if they don't have literacy, if they can't understand concepts, and if we don't teach them how to understand concepts, they can't move through the system. They can't learn it. Really, energy is we have to think about energy literacy, and I was really struck by that term. So that's the first comment I want to make. The second is we had today was very well laid out in terms of all the different areas and the different sessions. But the ones that I attended, we very much got back to energy sources in a big way, and it brings me back to the UDP consultations and how that was a broad range of there's 5 different areas that were covered in the UDP, yet everything came down to source. And so it's just, for me, that points us then to the need to define energy policy. That when we go out and we have these discussions, what are we actually talking about? Do we have to split it up? Do we have to put it in different pieces? And how are we going to have that discussion? Everybody's talked about the integration. And of course, integration, you need that when you've got such a complex area of policy such as energy. So people the public, my experience has been they're going to tend to focus on what hits them directly, and cost of electricity, source, et cetera. That's where they're going to go, environmental impacts, those kinds of things, from my perspective. Another piece that I found really that hit home was this, and it's been spoken about here across the panel, is the kind of the global Canadian provincial perspective, and how do we get through that? And there's been a number of comments today about innovating at the provincial level. You know, maybe starting provincially, at least in terms of having the discussions, building up our literacy, moving into the Western Canada piece where there's been some work already done, then perhaps into North America, and then globally, obviously keeping all of those pieces in mind. But we almost get into a policy inertia. And I talked I know in my session about a policy vacuum, in that it just seems so complex, it's so big, that we have to be able to think about how we're going to get this done, and how can we lead this, and how can Saskatchewan, with the resources that we have, how can we move forward? So I think that innovation piece at the provincial level really struck me. That leads us, in a sense, to my final point, and that is the connection between the political and the energy. And of course, that only makes sense. An energy policy gets made ultimately by politicians, so you've got that connection, but much more so here than in so many other policies. And one of our challenges is moving out of the four-year political. How do we have these discussions in a progressive fashion outside the four-year political cycle? How are we, some of us as policymakers and others as government decision makers, et cetera, how do we move this outside the four-year political cycle, still recognizing that the politics are obviously, as witnessed at lunch, are so important? And I think as mentioned across the whole day. I'll just end with, I think I said I'd end once already, but I got one more point, and that is on the consultation side, the varied approaches. And there was another term that Linda made in her presentation I thought was very, very useful, the new media. And how, and that goes back to the first point, the energy literacy, and how are we going to connect with not just us that sit in the room here now, but the younger people, and the people that really, the decisions that we make today, they're going to be the ones that are impacted by it. So how do we connect with them?
Okay, thank you very much. Rather than do the panel thing again, backwards and forwards, just any quick comments on anything anyone has said, and also anyone want to tackle the next steps question here.
One thing that I didn't mention that I think comes into this complexity a bit is this issue that there will be trade-offs, and that there isn't going to be a clear winner. Like, there's not going to be something that just comes up like a phoenix and you say, you know, we're going that way. and I think that's the reality of this, and so it increases its complexity. I made a few suggestions in my panel in terms of next steps. I said that one of the things I did before I came here was Google Saskatchewan energy policy, and ended up with sweet tweet, except for a set of three papers by the policy alternatives group, and I talked to a number of people, and nobody had read these papers, and they're brand new papers, so nobody else is Googling, I guess, but they were really pretty interesting, and because they talked about things that people haven't been talking about today in terms of biomass or geothermal, or some of these issues that may have pertinence for somebody in some part of Saskatchewan and not in others. So I think that, and I also said I really feel that if the government really cares about this and really wants to make it a big deal, that there's some kind of a reporting relationship at a very high level that says this person is the guru of this, someone that is trusted in Saskatchewan for being here for the long haul and not going to be in anybody's back pocket, and that is willing to take this on, and is willing to become the spokesperson for this. We've seen more and more in our fast media world that in fact people want to relate to somebody. We saw this during SARS, for example. that we needed somebody that we could trust, that we connect to. So if we're going to do something that's focused, that happens, maybe there has to be a different way of organizing government, that it's not through this multiple departments and bureaucracy and everybody. I've been one. I know you fight like hell for your own little bit of the soil. So, you know, maybe it has to go some other way in terms of the next steps for this. But I think involving the graduate school was extremely smart. Maybe you guys came up with the idea, but I think you need to have, we don't have many think tanks in our country compared to the United States, for example, that are up there. So I think getting the school involved was smart. But I think, to me, my job here was process rather than content. But I think the process has to be something different if the government is going to walk the talk, which is, this is critically important that we grab this issue, get people on board, and move. So I don't think that, I'm sorry, I don't think that means the ordinary peripheral agency department approach.
Yeah, hello? Yeah. I just wanted to add one thing in response to what has just been said. I don't, in kind of saying that I think it's important that Saskatchewan engage with the rest of the country, I don't want to suggest that it isn't important to start first by framing things in provincial terms, because there is no doubt that energy is principally a regional thing in Canada. It's just a totally different situation here than in Ontario or than in Quebec or in the Maritimes. Each one has, yeah, okay, we all put gas in our tanks to drive the cars, but the electricity systems are completely different, and energy as an export commodity is completely different. In Quebec, it's hydro. Here, it's oil and gas and uranium and so on. So I think there's no doubt that it has to be built up from the bottom upwards and not come directly from the top down. So in that sense, I think that what's so good about what you're doing here is that you're starting with a bounded system. And the province is actually not that huge in terms of population, though the energy picture is very complicated. So you actually have a situation where there are not so many players. So it's actually a manageable process to vision where you want to be in 30 or 40 years. What are the energy alternatives? How would you move forward? So I would, you know, my encouragement would say really focus on that. And then to the extent that your ideas are clarified, then it's easy to say, well, what we do or don't like with what other people are proposing, and how can we cooperate with others, and what do we do internationally, and so on. So the layers of complexity shouldn't be a barrier, but by starting in the bounded system that is essentially the provincial jurisdiction, it's possible to clarify things and push things forward in a way that will make all the other interlinkages, you know, negotiable.
From my perspective, and I talked a little bit about this, and I agree. I think that we can definitely start provincially, and I think this has to be a partnership, a very broad group that looks at this. It's not just it's not just at the graduate school. It's not just in government. It's not just in crowns. It's got to be quite a group of that comes together is one thing. The other thing that I would say is we don't necessarily have to. We tend to. We've got a problem. So let's just and I know I simplify this, and I'm not trying to be critical, but we try and come up with, well, let's find the solution. So we'll put a paper together, 3 or 4, a complex document, and there's the solution, and there's the end of it. And this is so complex that I don't think we can take that approach. It has to be incremental. Let's do the literacy first. Maybe let's just have the discussions without any endpoints before we even talk about endpoints, before people start to polarize and start to bring in all of their different views. Let's just have the discussion and then move ourselves through and lay it out clearly in an incremental fashion, knowing that we're not going to reach our goal in a year or two. It's going to take much longer than that.
Okay, thank you very much for kicking us off here. Please, I'd like to turn it over to you. You've sat very patiently for much of the day. There's been good audience interaction in the sessions that I attended, but now's your chance. If you have something that you wish to get off your chest, now's the moment to do it. And again, really, what are you taking away from today that you'd like to share with others, and particularly helpful for us? Where do we go from here?
Well, to avoid the awkward silence while Peter takes the microphone, I'll interject with a comment about action items, and it's an extension of something I said in the last breakout session, but I do think it's important that we think of integration as a process rather than an event, and it's not something that we're going to be able to say, well, in 2 years we're going to have integrated energy policy, that there's not necessarily a crowning moment or a culmination of this process of integration. And moreover, it's going to be a process that takes place in multiple different fora. It's not like we can say, well, let's convene a particular meeting or a particular physical location or a working group where that is where the policy gets integrated. We have to appreciate that takes place on a variety of different levels. Peter.
Two thoughts. I won't repeat my rant from the next room. From earlier in the previous session, but let me make just sort of a general observation, and that is that the energy debate, not just here, but pretty much universally, is sort of a mix of agony and ecstasy. You know, we have periods when the world is falling apart, and we have periods when we have, you know, irrational exuberance in markets. And I think we've heard some of that, and as a policy professor, I tell my students, policy should be driven by evidence either as the base or at least informing the dialogue. And I think we've repeated to ourselves some of the myths that we've created in Western Canada. And the rant next door was that it wasn't the NEP that led to the 25 years of a relatively slow energy in Western Canada. It was the world energy market was relatively slow, and we just were collateral damage. The other observation, so I think there's some, we need to go back to the assumptions in the policy dialogue. I think there's an assumption that that constrains our willingness to look at options regionally, nationally, and internationally that are based on stories that we tell ourselves that aren't true, that make us feel warm and fuzzy, but are not about the reality of the event we experienced. The second observation is more about moving forward beyond unpacking the problems, and that is that much of the dialogue today has been focused in on government policy, big P policy, and be it at the provincial or national or international level. And I think part of what we're dealing with is a change of expectations about what energy is in our economy and society. And that inextricably means you've got to engage those who have equity in the system, the producers, the supply chains, because they're the ones that are going to deliver the policy and respond to the policy. But even more importantly, I think we have to engage the civil society groups that are defining the expectations, because it's not government that says we want it to be sustainable. Those definitions of sustainability, as widely diverse as they are, come from social groups. And if you don't bring them in the room and begin to understand the nuances and the underlying assumptions, even if we deliver something that looks on the face of it to be consistent with expectations of our civil society, it won't necessarily improve the economic progress for the sector. So I guess there's two things. We need to unpack some of the myths, and we need to find new ways of broadening the dialogue beyond a government-focused policy debate to a tripartite policy debate where you've got government, industry, and the civil society groups that are changing the expectations from those two.
Thank you, Peter. And while, sorry, go right ahead.
Go ahead if you like.
No, please.
There's a document out of the Canada West Foundation called Extraordinary Future, which is an extraordinary document. It gives a vision of what the West is going to look like. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to do it. It's about, there's a summary by Dr. Roger Gibbons that's about a 2-hour read. It'll make you a better singer and a much happier person. But one of the elements that it references is in this new West, as we call ourselves, the reality that we in the West can start to determine to a much greater extent our own future than in the old West, where we used to look to Ottawa and say, tell us please, and therefore we'll do it. And as you've heard, and you know, when we've done that, when Ottawa's done that from a policy perspective on issues like energy, it hasn't always turned out so well. So I'm suggesting, and this is, I won't ask you to do this, but if I walked in here with $1 million per person and said by midnight tonight, I want a Western Canadian energy policy that you're comfortable enough to strut around the community, to do the consultation that needs to be done, not the end result, but to take it out based upon a framework that you think that the Canadian government and the people of Canada would embrace. If I said to you $1 million each, I think you would do it. I think you would be here at midnight, some of you. I think the capacity exists to do that. From what I've heard today as a relative newcomer into this sector, I think the capacity is to do it. And to your point, Joe, about the 4-year cycle, if we look with all due respect to governments, they think in 4-year cycles. They can't do a long-term plan. They can do it with you, but they can't do it alone. So my takeaway from this would be a request that the Johnson-Shoyama group, the Saskatchewan Research Council, working perhaps with Innovation Saskatchewan, sit down and do this. Don't create the absolute perfect plan, because if you wait for that, or worse than anything, if you do nothing, I'll tell you where we're going to be to your original question in a year. We're going to be back in here with the same comments, and somebody's going to stand up and say the president of the U.S. just said this, and my gosh, didn't Canada get screwed over because we didn't act, because we didn't have a policy. We may still be negatively impacted by another government's policy, but if we don't do something because we were too afraid to wait for the perfect policy, we're in trouble. We have the mechanism through the Johnson-Shoyama. We have the Saskatchewan Research Council to make sure, as was noted earlier, that we're basing everything that we do upon science. We have the capacity here. We simply don't have the policy. And if you look to other jurisdictions like China, do you think they're waiting to see what the U.S. is doing to determine their energy futures? I think not. Brazil, we heard this morning, I think not. I don't know why we would either.
The panel this morning talked about developing a national energy strategy. The panel this afternoon is talking about the same thing. In my readings and travels across the country, more and more policy analysts are saying the same thing. Industry groups are saying the same thing. NGOs are saying the same thing. And then we hear the luncheon talk by Minister Boyd, which says, you know, let the eastern bastards freeze in the dark, to paraphrase an old NEP phrase. We have an Alberta energy strategy paper that came out that says we support a national policy as long as we write it. You know, you have a Danny Williams government, you know, that basically says where was the Canadian government when we did Churchill Falls. So we have a very interesting case in Canada where we complain about top-down governance. We have a bottom-up approach that is hitting the provincial governments, and they're stomping down and saying, this is our fiefdom, okay? So how do you build a Western Gateway? How do you build you know, an LNG plant or a pipeline to Kitimat without a national strategy? How do you deal with transmission line usage out of Labrador into Quebec? How does Quebec get their hydroelectricity through New Brunswick into New England without buying the province? So my question to the panel, and I guess to the others, is how do we get rid of the provincial territoriality and the absolute fear by the federal government to touch energy? You know, I agree that Pierre Trudeau did not cause the collapse of world oil prices, as powerful as that man was. And I can say that in Regina because they would crucify me in Calgary to do so. But the myth is real. Whether it is, whether the facts are real, that's a different story. I mean, we're talking politics here, not reality. So the question to us is, how do we deal with those provincial jurisdictional battles and an absolute fear of the federal government, liberal or conservative?
Well, to be fair to Minister Boyd, there was a positive proposal that we heard there, which was very interesting to me, that the way to overcome what you've just described is to have regional building blocks, such that we can start with moving away from interprovincial jealousies. We can maybe defuse east versus west by scaling up, as it were, first at the level of regions. And that struck me as a very interesting suggestion. It was slightly problematic, of course, that the start of this was to be 3 provinces which had the same kind of interest in defending their resources. But nonetheless, that was something I think that we might want to take away from this. How could we contribute to that? Is that a worthwhile way of building things?
I think there needs to be a little clarification, though. If you look at the departed BC Premier, Mr. Campbell, and what he did, I think it takes some leadership and by some premiers to work together. And I think if you look at it from an Ottawa perspective, you see that the provinces are taking, where I live, you can see that the provinces are taking more and more initiative because they're just fed up with the federal government not taking action on things. So I'm a born optimist, but I'm not in the least bit optimistic about the federal government taking any leadership. Because I don't work for the federal government, I can say the following, and I said it to somebody earlier. If you were in Ottawa and you saw the lack of talent in the federal bureaucracy at high levels in order to advise federal ministers, and it's not welcome anyway, but put that aside for a moment, but if you saw the lack of talent that is there in terms of people promoted very fast or not having qualifications, just look at department by department and look at what kind of people. It's the manager, any manager can manage anything, and then you get switched around after 3 years. And it's extremely frightening. So maybe you should take some of the excellent people here and second them to Ottawa to advise or something. But I just do not feel any optimism at all about the federal capability to provide this. I was part of the task force that looked at the blackout, the results of the blackout in the East, and it was incredible. They had meeting after meeting of federal and provincial officials to look at, what was going to be the response, how we were going to, back up our electrical systems. And you know what we did? We turned it all over to American regulators. It was just absolutely shocking. It is now the federal FERC that runs, the electrical system in terms of electrical backup in Canada, that we were willing to turn it all over. So I don't mean to be a pessimist, but I am coming across as that. So I think these regional initiatives make a lot of sense. Sorry.
Will Kimber from Canada West Foundation. I want to thank the plug for the extraordinary conversations piece, and of course commend that to everyone. Secondly, I wanted to make everyone aware that Roger Gibbons and I have produced a paper that we've called Common Ground on a Canadian Energy Strategy, and that will be released formally on the Canada West Foundation website next Tuesday. We'll be presenting it at a conference in Winnipeg on Thursday and Friday, which is for the Winnipeg Consensus Group, which is a group of think tanks that have been working for the past 2 years on a consensus on a Canadian energy strategy. And the purpose of the Common Ground paper was to do essentially a literature review of all of the material that's come out of civil society, from industry, from government, and actually show that there is a degree of agreement on some of the big rocks in the debate. Clearly, we can't be Pollyanna about the difficulties in making progress, but we have shown in that paper through quotes in the public domain that Dave Collier from CAP and Milo Reynolds from the Pembina Institute can both agree that robust environmental stewardship is essential. So just wanted to mention those two things. And thirdly, a question, and I hope it's not too mischievous, but we've talked about all the talk? And what is the Johnson Shomer School's plans following up from this conference to actually give life and further traction to the momentum that we have so far? Thank you.
I'm not sure you're allowed to ask questions. I may have to rule that one out of order. The group that you describe, I think, is extremely important, and it reminds us that there are many initiatives going on, and in many ways, I think just bringing people together, linking these initiatives up, is a huge step forward. But I don't think we can lead. Unless we have direction, unless there are people who are prepared to take this. We can talk, we can write, we can discuss as much as we like, but the hard part, I think, is to move this discussion into the realm of practicalities. And we had a very interesting example of how that had been done in the Netherlands in our engagement session this afternoon. That may not be the appropriate model, but we need a model for doing that, and it's one of the things that I was hoping might come out of this. I saw Florian approach the microphone, so maybe we'll give him a say here.
Florian Kern from the University of Sussex in the UK. So I'm from Europe. This is my first time in Saskatchewan, and I wanted to take the opportunity and mention some of my take-home messages from this. And the first one is really, in the UK, we say energy policy is climate policy, and has to be, because most of our emissions are from the energy sector. And this seems to be an unpopular message here. What I heard in the morning, it was largely about how do we maximize the economic gain from our resource endowments. Of course, this is easy to say coming from a country where we don't have these kind of resources, but I think this is something very crucial that needs a bit more thinking about. The second point I wanted to make is about this idea that the energy sector is facing a multifaceted challenge, of which climate change is only one of the problems, and we've mentioned the other types of problems. I think it is important to remember, in whatever kind of integrated policy framework we come up with, that it's not a technological fixed solution type of problem. It's not about fuels. We had this point earlier about talking about different fuels. It's not that. It's a bigger challenge. It's about social changes, about policy changes, about institutional challenges. And I am from Germany myself, so Germany is also a federal state, but I think not of the same making as Canada. And I think Canada is facing a particular institutional challenge with its federalism that seems to be quite defunct at sort of addressing this problem, and sorry for being so blunt. If it was from the UK originally, I'd probably be more eloquent in getting this across. But I'm not, so here we go. Okay, and the last point is about the public. And I think literacy is a great concept and is a good starting point. But I think we need to think about the public, people in energy transitions in a more sophisticated way. People are playing a multifaceted role in transitions, I think. One is you can think about consumption decisions. So this is about people buying small cars or bigger cars. Okay, so this is one way of thinking about the consumer. If we're talking about a decentralized energy system, maybe we're also talking about investment, for example, in microgeneration. For example, it's a different role for a consumer. It also requires a different institutional setup for the energy market, for example. We can also think of the public or people in terms of citizens. Do we support politicians who have ambitious climate or environmental goals in their agenda or not? Public support for policy instruments that might hurt some people. We were talking about carbon taxes earlier, I think, is another role to think about. Then there are behavioral, lifestyle change issues we need to think about. So people are actors in this process. And maybe the last point, career choices. I mean, in the UK, we don't have a lot of trained nuclear engineers anymore. Now the government is putting a lot of money in trying to find people or convince people that this is a good career path. And so people also make choices in that way. And that might be important. So yeah, a more multifaceted understanding of the role of people, I think, is important for an integrated energy policy. Thank you very much.
A last chance for a final thought. No? Well, in that case, it falls to me to close this session. We have had, I think, a tremendously interesting and stimulating discussion. As you say, the hard part is to know where to go from here, and any and all suggestions are welcome. The Johnson Shayama Graduate School of Public Policy is a remarkable institution, but it cannot make policy. It can really only forward the debate. It can bring people together. It can provide a forum, but we lack the authority to actually create an integrated energy policy, quite rightly, in my view. So it would be a very dangerous thing if we actually had that authority. But what I would like to do, thank you, what I'd like to do in conclusion is to thank the many people who have been involved in organizing this conference. This bit of a conference is always a little bit like the Academy Awards, only you don't get a little statuette to hold and you don't have to wear a tuxedo. But as you can imagine, this took a fair amount of organising. But first of all, I would like to thank once again the more than 20 speakers who we had today, many of whom came from further afield than the province, and it was, I think, a testament to their performance that we have had such a stimulating and rewarding conference. Thank you very much indeed. At the outset, we mentioned that this conference had sponsors, and I won't mention them again. But there was an organising group, and it falls to me to have the happy duty to name and thank them. This conference was put on by the Outreach and Training division of the Johnson Shayama School, referred to often, I think, by no means in hyperbole, as the jewel in the crown of the school. Anyone who has been involved in organising a conference knows really what that's like if you have to do it on your own from start to finish. It's really like crossing difficult ground in terrible weather without the appropriate equipment, if I can put it that way. Whereas organising a conference through outreach and training is like being put in the back of a very luxurious limousine and whisked from your concept to your destination. And I, for one, am extremely grateful of the way this worked. ONT, of course, is headed by Dan Perrins. There was a group who really thought about the concept here, involving Ken Rasmussen, the Associate Director of the school, Jim Marshall, Kathy McNutt, and I have to thank too, it's always a good idea to thank your boss. I have to thank Michael Atkinson for believing that we could actually have a conference on as large a topic as this. But most of all, I want to thank those who were directly involved in the hands-on organisation of this conference, and that gives me pleasure to name them: Serena Wojcik, Kendra Gellner, Erica Schindel, Erna Pearson, and the very many student volunteers who you saw today who made this event possible. And it's with great pleasure that I acknowledge my debt to them and thank them. Thank you. And last but not least, thank you all for coming and making this a great success. And please, there will of course be the transcripts, or at least I'm not quite sure in what form, but there will be perhaps the video, but there will be a record of this conference that you can access. And if you missed parts of it because of the parallel sessions, please don't hesitate to access it. Thank you all very much.